Hey y'all! So welcome back to my channel, and I know for most of my YouTube videos that I do just me talking, recording videos, but today we have a very special guest, and I know this is not a normal YouTube video style content, but I don't care, it's my channel, and Gabrielle is amazing, and she has some awesome content to share with us. So I did some consulting back with you a few months ago, and I instantly knew, like, I need to share some of this. Obviously, some of the questions I asked are very personal for myself and clients, but just in general, there is so much misinformation with, gut health, air quotes. And I think that, gut health, like spelled all like lower and uppercase, right? And I think that it's, we just need to clear it up. So first and foremost, thank you so much for coming on. And please introduce, yourself and kind of a little bit about your background.
Oh, thank you for having me. So it's great to be able to kind of spread this content around and dispel myths and whatnot. I feel like that's been kind of my niche that's been unfolding lately. So I'm Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro for people who don't know. I have my PhD in the area of gut microbiome and skeletal muscle metabolism, and a background also in exercise science for my bachelor's. Before I was consulting with Renaissance Periodization and my own company, Vitamin PhD Nutrition, I was in academia for 4 years and taught exercise science and sport nutrition. So the niche that I think is really unfolding for me, because I'm super evidence-based and it's awesome that people are so receptive to that. It's kind of around busting myths and adding context and nuance to the research coming out around the gut microbiome.
Yeah, so Gabrielle is actually an expert. She will not call herself that, but she is somebody, I know you mean, but she is somebody who could actually claim that title, but because she is actually an expert, she won't claim that title. So I just want to get right into it and just kind of dive into a few of the like hot topics and things that I see a lot. And I asked questions on my Instagram and I got some good feedback on these as well. So first and foremost, food sensitivity tests. These seem to be all the rage. And a lot of people will say, oh, I went and got this food sensitivity test and I'm, sensitive or allergic to a whole slew of foods. And it might be foods that they eat frequently and don't necessarily have any problems. And I'm all for, like, not everybody's going to be able to eat every single food. Like, we're all going to have little issues to where every time I eat this, I just don't feel very good. But these are, these tests are coming back and it's either like random foods or foods that you eat all the time and have no issues. So kind of what is the background with food sensitivity tests? Why might people be seeing those results? And then are they valid? Is there any valid ones?
Right. So most of the time when people are actually pretty much all the time when people are talking about a food sensitivity, they are kind of confusing what might be an intolerance, which is enzyme mediated, or an allergy, which is immune mediated. So a sensitivity is kind of made up. And these food sensitivity tests are using a specific antibody, an IgG antibody, which is really just a recognition antibody. So it doesn't actually play a role in initiating or causing an immune response to a food. It's just something that our body uses as sort of a name tag that we've been exposed to this substance before. And so it makes sense, actually, that when we do these food sensitivity tests, we see a list of foods that we eat all the time. Okay. Because that's what it is. So if this were a test, if they claimed this test will show you foods that you have eaten, that would be accurate. That's what that test is doing. It's showing you foods that you have eaten. But it's not showing you, it's not able to screen for food sensitivities. What might happen coincidentally is that you are eating a food that is perhaps contains FODMAPs, and that might cause some GI distress. And so when you eliminate that food, you then eliminate the cause of the GI distress, not that you had a sensitivity to it. If it's an enzyme-mediated thing, if we're looking at an intolerance, that could be a maldigestion or a malabsorption issue. There are some substances that are just malabsorbed by all humans, like sorbitol, dietary fibers. So we don't have the enzymes to break down those dietary fibers. That's why they pass the large intestine. They're fermented by bacteria. So in that case, it's not even really an enzyme deficiency. We just don't have that enzyme. In some cases, we are kind of supposed to make that enzyme, like lactase, to break down lactose. Some of us don't. That's lactose intolerance, and so that would be a dietary intolerance, enzyme mediated. If we have an actual allergy, We could have an Ige mediated allergy. So that's another type of antibody. And you can screen for those if you go to an allergist. But that still isn't necessarily a positive diagnosis of an allergy, because we can have some IgE mediated responses to foods without actually having a full-on allergic response. Now that can be life-threatening. So if you have an anaphylactic response to that, that's very dangerous. People probably know if they have an actual food allergy. We can also have non-IgE mediated allergies, which are a little bit harder to screen for, but you could do an oral tolerance test for that. And usually if you're going to if you have a non-IgE mediated food allergy, you'll see extreme gastric distress within about 30 minutes, like diarrhea and vomiting. So those are kind of a little bit more telling. If you're just experiencing some bloating, maybe some changes in bowel movements, then it's probably not an immune mediated thing. It's probably just something you could fix with a dietary intervention. And if you're doing something like an IgG food sensitivity test, you're just going to get a list of foods that you have eaten at some point in your life, and it's not telling you anything useful. It's really expensive, and no, it's not valid for screening for allergies or intolerances.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think that is something that, I don't know, within the past few years, I've just noticed a lot of people going to get, and I understand why people would want that, because they're like, hey, I've been having some issues with, my stomach. This test should be able to show me, because like blood work shows good stuff. So like, why wouldn't this work? But yeah, after talking to you, there's not really much evidence behind them. So you guys, if you're going to, you want to get one of these done, I would kind of just steer away from it, to be honest. And if you think that you actually have a true, allergy or something like that, go to the, dermatologist. Not dermatologist. What I mean.
Yeah, but yeah, an allergist could do
an allergy. I'm like a dermatologist. Like, you could also go to the dermatologist to make sure your skin looks good, but go to the allergist for the allergy test.
Yeah, but and dermatologists would be able to, sometimes they can, if they suspect like that could be a manifestation, like if you have hives or something like that. So yeah, but yeah, in any case, try to avoid the IgG food sensitivity tests, and those are usually sold by practitioners that are not gastroenterologists and immunologists and allergists. They're going to be sold by like alternative medicine practitioners, which often seem to promote invalid tests.
Yes, and unfortunately, so I always try and look at kind of every side and want to give every side like an opportunity to be right. And there are some, I would say, some functional medicine doctors who do a really good job, you know what I mean, at putting stuff together that is logical and based off of science, and does use just a bit of a different approach than maybe just normal, Western medicine. But I have seen some issues with some of these holistic doctors, just because, not even issues with it, but they give a lot of the same, everybody has the same problems, which I understand that if you're seeing only one type of client, you might see similar trends over time. But I mean, there's no way that you can tell me that every person that walks into your office has a whole laundry list of these issues that needs all of these things addressed. You know what I mean? And when somebody's very vulnerable and they are in a position to where they're like, I will listen to anybody because I'm in so much pain, and this is kind of like their last resort, it becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy. And I mean, the mental side of things is so strong that like I don't even think we could quantify that. So if somebody finally tells you like I have the answer, you're like, sign me up, man, whatever it is. So that's kind of the only thing that I have an issue with, and that's not all functional medicine doctors. Obviously, there's plenty of good ones, but there are people who maybe aren't qualified, who are giving out tests and giving out recommendations that can be, maybe not even that harmful, but just not helpful, right? I mean, it could be harmful, but usually just not helpful. Now, so speaking kind of food intolerances, so I'll have clients and other people too just reach out to me who out of nowhere seemingly have these just random food issues, right? So I've been eating these foods for a while, and then all of a sudden they started giving me issues. Or I cut these foods out of my diet and then I added them back in. Now I have these problems. So kind of like what is going on here with the gut to where like you could be sporadically seeing these issues, or if you cut food out, like what would be happening with that?
I think it's important to realize that, we are really kind of lacking the structure of scientific method there when we're like, oh, I suddenly have symptoms and I'm attributing it to foods. that I have been eating continuously. So really, the food there is a controlled variable. Like if the food hasn't changed at all, I would say first, let's look at everything else that could have potentially changed, because there are other factors that can impact gastrointestinal symptoms, especially in folks who have IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. Stress can play a huge role. So if it's like your diet hasn't changed, but your life is suddenly much more stressful, or your training has changed, maybe you're overreaching, or you're thinking about food, but forgetting like drinks that may have changed. So I would say first we want to look at what's going on outside of the diet, because it's probably less likely that it's the diet if nothing has changed. Mm-hmm. Now, if on the other hand, people have removed foods from their diet for a long time and then reintroduced them, that could be theoretically because we are outsourcing the job of some processing to the gut microbiome. So that means those microbes, they are producing enzymes that we don't produce. So they have a huge genetic database. Like they can process all sorts of different things that we can't, and all the stuff that we can. And so if maybe your diet has been super low in fiber for a long time, we know that actually it takes a very short period of time to see changes in both the bacteria that are present, or the microbes that are present, and also the genes that are being expressed. So very rapidly they respond to changes in diet. Now, if then you reintroduce a bunch of fiber or a bunch of FODMAPs into your diet, you may need to give it some time to kind of catch back up. So that means that we need to allow for the microbial number just to increase. So the number of microbes that can process those carbohydrates are increased, and then also the genes expressed to make the enzymes to process those substances. In the meantime, you may find that you are feeling a lot more water in the lumen of the intestine. So you might have some really loose stools. You might have some more distension and bloating because that fiber can pull water into the gut. If you do see a really rapid bloom in bacterial count and they're fermenting those fibers, then you could experience a really big increase in gas production as well. So that's really what we're probably looking at there, is just changes in the bacterial colonies in response to rapid changes in diet.
Yeah, and I see this a lot because people will, diet, whether it's a lifestyle diet or just a, especially a comp diet, right? So somebody's, drastically lowered their calories. I just find anecdotally that people just, when they've just been dieting for a while, their body just doesn't seem to digest things as well, right? Like they're just more sensitive to everything, right? Mm-hmm. So you're already in a place where you're a little bit more sensitive after dieting for months, and you've taken certain foods out, and then now you add them back in. And if you don't do it kind of this like stepwise fashion, kind of like we're bringing calories up, we also need to kind of bring the food variety back up, because I'll know people who like, oh, I cut out red meat, or, the last few months or last few weeks just because it was higher fat. And then now I added it back in, and I ate it every day this week, and now my stomach is a bowling ball and distended, and I feel terrible. And it's like, well, for you, like I can eat red meat year round, doesn't matter, I'm good to go. For some people, they're a little bit more sensitive to something like that, right? So it's just going to depend, I think. And what you said about the stress was, I'm so glad you said that, because I've been trying to say this so much to people. And literally, I mean, there is a direct Lauren Conlon data, direct correlation, not real data, but of my clients who are very, very high negative stress perception, who then have gut problems, who have these digestive issues, who always have stomach pain. And we can do different stuff with their diet. We do all these different things. But because they're in that position chronically of just so sympathetic, their body, they always just have GI issues. So it's so fascinating. And that was really the first time I really realized that, like, wow, like this, like stress is not, like stress perception is important, but it's also important for like their gut, because I started just seeing that as being like a huge issue for people, like whether it's bloating or cramps or just like, oh, I don't feel good after I eat this. And it's always those clients. So I'm so glad that you said that. Listen, guys, it's not just me, okay? It's we got somebody else on here. Now, another thing that's pretty common now, kind of on the interwebs and just in general, is, everybody seems to have leaky gut. Everybody seems to have Sibo. And understandably, these are real intolerances, and these not even these are real issues. Kind of like I feel like, celiacs and gluten like a few years back became kind of like, oh, everybody had to go gluten-free even if you didn't have celiacs. I feel like now the new thing kind of is like leaky gut SIBO, and that clearly there's people who have celiac disease, and we need to be like aware of, you know, that. Same thing, some people have SIBO, like for real. And when you first read about this, it's like, it like again, like, oh my God, I have this, you know, like because you read these symptoms and you feel like, oh, this must be me. So what are kind of the things, you know, between, you know, leaky gut, SIBO, like kind of terms like that, and, you know, how do you actually really test for that or know if it is an issue?
Yeah. These are really tricky, especially because the way that they're sort of promoted or like marketed online is that they'll pick like the most general symptoms that like every human being has ever experienced. Do you sometimes feel tired and bloated? Have you ever farted? Like you
Yeah.
have SIBO, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, it's me. This is my problem." So, or you know, leaky gut is the cause of all of our problems today. And like, if you heal your gut, like you'll be able to lose weight, and you know, your
Fix your
mood will be better.
thyroid and get everything.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, we've taken, you know, these phenomena that do occur, and just extrapolated them to market whatever we can, you know. So leaky gut, it refers, and this is actually, so this term, even though it's been sort of bastardized, leaky gut was actually coined by a researcher in the field. So this was many years ago, a sort of a more, I think, applicable term when referring to intestinal permeability. So we have this single layer of intestinal cells stacked next to each other, and they are supposed to be selectively permeable. So ideally, the things that are entering our bloodstream are just passing through those cells first. So there are specific receptors in the cells, things are processed, they come out the other end, they end up in the blood, and they're supposed to be there. But there are these tight junction proteins that exist between the intestinal cells. And sometimes the regulation of those proteins can be modified in such a way that substances then leak between the cells. And what I looked at for my PhD, and this is how I got into the gut microbiome stuff, was a substance called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. And it comes from specific types of bacteria from their cell wall. And when they die, the LPS is liberated, and then it can pass between those intestinal cells and bind to receptors of the immune system and cause low-grade systemic inflammation that's been associated with type 2 diabetes. So I wanted to know, like, we used to inject mice with this because that's what you do in research. You're just terrible to rodents. And then we would take out their skeletal muscle and measure its ability to handle substrates. So we would add fatty acids or glucose and see how well it could switch, how responsive the mitochondria were. And I was like, why are we injecting them with LPS? What is this? And it turns out, oh, well, it's this constituent of cell wall, of bacterial cell walls, and, you know, leaks out through the gut theoretically and causes problems. Come to find out that that actually does seem to be elevated in concurrent with high fat feeding, and it's associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity. So there is definitely a gut, a microbiome, skeletal muscle metabolism link via LPS. That's just one of the potential endotoxins that can leak out. But the number of people that have quote unquote leaky gut, we don't know. It's actually not a clinical diagnosis. And intestinal permeability increases in response to meals in general, high fat feeding, in some disease states, exercise, and we don't really have good data on, you know, what are the normal levels of intestinal permeability? How long does it last? Is it something that's just latent between meals, or is it something that's, you know, chronically elevated? When does it really become problematic? We don't even have a clear diagnosis for below sepsis, which is go to the hospital, you're going to die soon. But below sepsis, what levels of LPS would be considered to be metabolic endotoxemia? So we don't have even clinically, we don't have a clinical cutoff for that. So there's no way to sort of diagnose, you have leaky gut or you have metabolic endotoxemia. And funnily enough, like, some labs would have these LPS ranges that should have been septic. And we actually saw after some high fat meal challenges, like levels that should have been septic for our participants as well. Like, wow, are you okay? Like, you seem fine, but you should probably be dead or something. So, you know, even in how we're measuring those, there's a lot of variability and just a lot of, potential for interpretation, I guess. So that's leaky gut. In terms of SIBO, that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, it looks like there are some groups of people who might be at greater risk of developing SIBO, specifically people with like short bowel syndrome, or individuals who are on chronic chronic strong antacids, because that changes the pH of that proximal section of the small intestine near the stomach. And
those are the PPIs, right?
Yeah, PPIs would be one example, exactly. So because we're changing the pH and we're making it a little bit less acidic there, we allow for the growth of more bacteria, and bacteria that really shouldn't be in the small intestine. So a lot of those fermenters that are meant for the colon. So that is something that can happen. The problem there is, again, we don't have, so we can make a diagnosis of SIBO, but it's difficult because we don't have a gold standard for the way that we test for it. So we use generally, so you can do a duodenal aspiration. So you can go into the duodenum, that first part of the small intestine, and actually culture. And if it's really rich in microbes, and this is very invasive, but if it's really rich in microbes, then you can say, okay, there's probably SIBO. Usually we're doing breath tests. And depending on how the breath test is administered in terms of the substrate that's used, and then how long the clinic takes that out, and so the timeline after the substrate is administered, the accuracy, and so that gets to how the specificity and also the sensitivity. So specificity and sensitivity will allow us to determine, is it really SIBO? Like, is it really in the small intestine and not in the large intestine? And how sure are we that it actually is SIBO and not something else? Ranges from 17% to 100%. So, and because clinics are able to administer this test sort of differently, and they even will have their different clinical cutoffs for what they consider to be a positive diagnosis, you may end up with a false positive or a false negative. And you could go on and do the duodenal culture. It's just going to be really invasive, and who knows if that's going to be covered and whatnot. What they're probably going to do for you anyway is give you antibiotics. So if you already know ahead of time that you don't want to do antibiotics, because a lot of people don't, they want to go through other means, I would say it's probably maybe not even worth it to do the breath test. And just keeping in mind the range of potential accuracy there could be extremely low. So
really that's the best way you think to clear up SIBO would be the antibiotics?
That's currently the most effective and most common intervention. So there are really two different antibiotics that most gastros would use, and I've seen anywhere from 7 to 14 days usually. And it seems to be, and antibiotics can be super effective for that. They're actually even an effective intervention for irritable bowel syndrome in some folks. And I'm not super, yay or nay on antibiotics. I don't have any strong emotional ties to them. It's just one of the realities. If you do get a positive diagnosis, I would say if you are looking for that, you want to make sure that the substrates they're going to be using would either be glucose or lactulose. Those are probably going to be, those would have the best chance of giving you the most accurate diagnosis.
So what would be some ways, so let's say you do have SIBO, right? And maybe you don't want to do the antibiotics. You don't even want to go through the test. You're like, I think I might have something. Would there be anything, or would that kind of go into the elimination kind of diet stuff, or is that just going to be super personal?
Yeah, I think, there are some other sort of alternative treatments that I've seen. The only one that I think has maybe interesting support would be oil of oregano as an antimicrobial. But again, we have to be very careful about how we're extrapolating data on antimicrobials, because putting something into a petri dish and watching its action there,
way different.
Totally different. Yeah. And some of these are being used in protection against biofilms. We don't really have strong evidence that biofilms form in a human's gastrointestinal tract. So that's another kind of, thing to watch out for. But I would say, yeah, if, and I'm not going to claim that this treats anything, but I think it's a good idea to first start with the elimination, just because it's free to do a systematic elimination diet, it very often does improve symptoms if a person has IBS. And if that doesn't work, then you can probably be pretty sure that, like, okay, I'm having a lot of gas and bloating, maybe it's something else.
Yeah, so let's go into that. So when you say elimination diet, I know that you're probably talking about the FODMAP restriction to start, which we can talk about the kind of the evidence behind that. But I would say that a lot of people, when they say I'm eliminating foods, they immediately, it's dairy, gluten, and sugar, which the sugar cracks me up because these people are still eating carbs. So unless you're eating a carnivore diet, you are eating sugar, just FYI. But I know people they mean added sugars, but I just wish they would just add that, like just add in added sugars, not just sugar, but that's just my nuance and being annoying. So is there any validity to people, in your opinion, just cutting out dairy, gluten, sugar? And then if, probably not, but if there is, let us know. And then if not, what would be a better kind of elimination diet, and what is the evidence there?
Yeah. So the funny thing with cutting out gluten is that sometimes people do feel better, not because they've removed the gluten, but because they've removed the fructans, which are a FODMAP that accompany gluten in wheat products. So there could be that they do feel better. It's just that they haven't been able to determine whether it was the gluten or the fructans. Yeah. Now, if your doctor suspects, actual celiac disease, that is a clinical diagnosis, and there are tests to be done, but you actually do have to be eating quite a lot of gluten up to the point of the test for some of the tests that they would do. So if you had eliminated gluten for a long period of time before the test, you actually would have to reintroduce it. Dairy is one that, because a lot of people are lactose intolerant, sometimes removing dairy can actually help you feel better if you don't handle lactose. Then the idea there is that if you want to start having dairy again at some point, you would just have to titrate in the amount. So you start with a really small amount first, see how you handle that, and then increase as you go on. Also keep in mind that there are some forms of dairy that are actually almost free of lactose, or have very low lactose amounts. So if it's something that's been cultured or fermented, so there are many hard cheeses that people can still eat, strained Greek yogurt. So some of those things are actually still tolerable. So you wouldn't have to completely eliminate dairy if you wanted to eliminate lactose. And then in terms of eliminating sugar, like you said, I mean, sugar is an umbrella term to refer to a lot of different things. And like even our added sugars, they're like, oh, it's from sugarcane or it's from beetroot. And like, well, technically those are all plants. So you could be like, sugar is from plants. And so, it's okay.
Yeah. You can spin it so many different ways. And I understand, like, there are benefits of, maybe cutting some of these things out, right? Like you said, there are some people who just can't tolerate lactose, but maybe you can have a little bit, right? I just think that like blindly chopping off like all three of these things when we see these kind of common elimination diets really just doesn't make sense. And you're not really pinpointing the issue, because now you've just cut a lot of foods out, and you probably also just cut a lot of calories out. So you're just kind of cleaning up a lot of the stuff. And I am not sitting here and saying that people should be eating tons of added sugar. Like, most of those foods are not necessarily nutrient dense, so we shouldn't be focusing on them. So instead of saying cutting all this out, we should instead say, hey, let's add in these more optimal foods for your body and for your digestion. So again, it's kind of the semantics and the nuance there that just pisses me off, but that's just kind of, that's how we are. And I know that can frustrate people, but it's like, just say what you actually need to say. But so in general, the FODMAP thing, which is something that I really took away and I've actually used with some of my clients, is the, actually using this, because it's so hard to find any kind of evidence-based stuff. And when you've tried a lot of things with people, like, hey, we're going to food journal, we're going to see what kind of bothers you. Hey, let's take out this one thing. Let's make sure your stress is under control. Let's make sure you're drinking enough water, like all these things. And then if it's still not working, okay, let's maybe try this. So kind of explain a little bit about the low FODMAP stuff, and then the app that you told me about, which I think is awesome resource for people.
Yeah. So the Low Fodmap Intervention was actually developed by Monash University, and it is a systematic process, and there are a few different manifestations of it, a few different iterations that you can use depending on the type of client that you're working with and their background and their diet. But the general idea is that we take a 3-phase approach. So you have an elimination phase usually, and then you have a testing phase, and then you have a reintroduction phase. So the idea is not to use a low FODMAP diet forever. It's simply to temporarily remove the carbohydrate sources that are most likely to be causing bloating, gas, and uncomfortable bowel movements, and then test them in a systematic way, titrating up the amount over time, so you can determine how much of each type of those carbohydrates you can tolerate. And then you get to the reintroduction where you add in all of the foods that you can comfortably tolerate. So your fiber intake will temporarily be reduced, and your FODMAP intake will be temporarily reduced, but then you try to bring it back up as high as you can. The reason that we don't want to keep it for indefinitely would be the same changes that we see with the low FODMAP diet, because it's lower in fiber and prebiotic fiber specifically. We see that with gluten-free diets. We see it with ketogenic diets. We see it with animal-based diets. So there was one that was done, kind of the landmark study comparing a plant-based versus animal-based diet. But we see kind of changes in the relative abundance of bacterial species. We see sometimes a loss in diversity, and we do see changes in the shape of the entire ecosystem. So in terms of, there are bacteria that are supposed to hang out in the lumen, and there are bacteria that are supposed to hang out in the mucus. But if the diet is devoid of fiber, they start to then move to new places, and they start to actually break down that mucus to get carbohydrate sources. They need carbs. So we don't want to have that as a long-term diet. It's intended to be a short-term intervention with a testing phase. And in some cases, we don't do it in the same way. We might have a person whose diet is already fairly low in FODMAPs, so we would just test the specific foods that would be most likely triggering to them. We can also encourage them to eat more foods that aren't high in FODMAP, and then just look at pinpointing just the specific food. So we don't necessarily have to do like a whole whitewash of the diet and clear everything out and start new with just these low FODMAP things. Sometimes it's like, oh, okay, your only FODMAP foods are like avocados and apples. We will just do those two, and we don't have to worry about the rest of it. I know, and those are the ones I bring those up because they seem to be problematic for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Damn, and those hit home. I'm like, what is it? There is like a noise right outside of my. It sounds like somebody put a ladder up against my house. Sorry, I'm like, what is going on?
They're just gonna climb up.
Gonna climb up. Santa Claus is here. All right. Anyways, ignore my squirrel brain. Yeah, I think, and so the university that developed this, the Monash University, actually has this app. So what I think is really cool is because obviously you can look it up, what is a low FODMAP diet, blah blah blah. But a lot of people are like, well, what the hell can I eat or what can I eat? So they put it in kind of color system. So it's green, yellow, red. So you kind of know, okay, green is obviously go, yellow is maybe moderate, and then red would be let's not touch it. So if you are going through an elimination phase, obviously you're just going to stick with the greens. And then when you're trying stuff out, you could maybe try some of the, the yellows and the reds. And what they do is they give you the amount too. So you can eat 30 grams of it, but 50 is no go. So I think that's really cool. And it just makes it easier on people because it is, it is semi-restrictive, and you don't realize it. There's just, these random healthy foods that have FODMAPs in them that could be just really disrupting to people. So I think that's super awesome. That is a good resource, and overall the app is pretty good from what I saw. So I think that pretty much, if you're looking to do something that's semi-elimination, first, journal kind of food, just see what is bothering you, right? And then, look at the lifestyle factors, how you're eating, hydration, sleep, stress management. And then if things still aren't clearing up after all that, it is potentially helpful to try maybe something like, FODMAP. But all these other anti-inflammatory elimination stuff, whenever somebody tells me that, I just and some of the stuff is good. Some of the things that they're saying to do are legit. I'm not against it. But then some of the stuff is so off the wall that they just throw these random things in there that I'm like, that just ruined it for me. Now I don't believe this. There is no rhyme or reason as to why this would be a thing. So I think that's really, really important. And I did want to touch a little bit back on the antibiotics. So I know you said that you're pretty like non-partial to them. So say somebody, obviously they do, from what I understand, have an impact on the gut microbiome, particularly after lots of use, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people are more aware of that now, I think, but maybe it's just people that I know, I'm not sure. But I know, I mean, even now, like somebody like my grandma's age, every time she gets sick, they're like, oh, just here, take a Z-Pack. It's like, whoa, hello, we gotta take a step back. Because now, and of course she's older, so it's a little bit different, but somebody is, kind of early middle age, you don't really want to just be taking stuff like that all the time because it can cause distress. But let's say you have to take antibiotics, right? Like what is actually happening? And I understand there's different strains, but like what as a general whole is happening and how can you, kind of bounce back from that?
So it actually really depends on the antibiotic. So there's some evidence that amoxicillin really doesn't do much of anything. So that's great. I mean, like that's one that's pretty common. All right. So we don't see any significant perturbations to the microbiome. But then if you're on something that's, a little bit gnarlier, a stronger antibiotic, vancomycin, that really does have some significant impacts on the gut microbiome. We don't have a lot of data looking at long-term follow-up. And the other issue is that because we have such huge inter-individual variability, it's hard for us to say like what's going to happen in your gut versus my gut, like probably two totally different things. But what we have seen so far is that, again, it's antibiotic dependent. It's sort of dependent on your native microbiome, so what you started with. Also dependent on whether you have a pathology of some sort. So if you have IBD or that's really probably going to be the most concerning one, but one where you're going to have perhaps marked dysbiosis, although that means different things, to different labs and different diseases. And then the other thing is what you're doing while you're on the antibiotics and after the antibiotics. So most people are kind of concerned with how do I get my gut back to where it was? Maybe you don't want your gut back to where it was. For one thing, sometimes the antibiotics actually can help. Like maybe you had some form of dysbiosis, personal dysbiosis beforehand. So we don't necessarily always want it to get back to baseline. In healthy individuals, it looks like things just go back on their own. If you're already physically active and eating a varied diet, you don't really have to do anything. If you want to take an extra step, you could potentially do an autologous fecal transplant. So you do your own fecal transplant. Probably most people don't want to do that, understandably, because we don't want to ingest our own feces. I don't recommend doing that. It's very dangerous. When we do that, and you do it in a clinical setting, it's processed. And it might be that, a lot of people think
everybody's like, what the fuck? We are turning this show.
They're like, she's saying what I think she's saying, like eating poop. Yeah. They have enema style too, though. And so the other option that, people want to look into would be taking a probiotic. But it doesn't look like probiotics reliably help to reestablish the native microbiome after antibiotics. Some seem to increase, they are represented in the stool. So we see increased bacterial numbers of those probiotic bacteria in the stool. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually taking up residence in the colon. In many cases, they don't seem to do anything at all to the microbiota of the individual as they pass through. And in at least one study, they've shown that it actually delayed reestablishment of the native microbiome. So that could be problematic. They experienced what they would consider to be a form of dysbiosis, because even though they had enrichment of lactobacilli, the overall diversity of the gut was extremely low. So what we could do instead is make recommendations perhaps for dealing with some of the symptoms that come with antibiotic use, like antibiotic-associated diarrhea. And it looks like the most effective probiotic for that would be S. boulardii, which is actually a yeast. So it's not going to be affected by the antibiotics, and does seem to help mitigate some of those symptoms. So that's probably the best recommendation that I would be able to provide, and just like make sure that you're eating a diet that's high in microbe accessible carbohydrates, because if you want to support the growth of organisms, you have to give them energy on which they can thrive.
Yeah, your body needs micronutrients, so it's not just necessarily how many carbs can you eat, it's kind of what are you eating, you know what I mean? And the variety is really key too, and I know that's something that a lot of us struggle with. but it is super important. So another hot topic to follow up antibiotics is artificial sweeteners, which I know is, again, highly debated as well. And this is something that, I mean, again, I've seen variations with different clients. Like there's some people who they're just pretty spot on with their diet, and they have just, they've tracked stuff and they've seen hey, it's literally just this. It's just this one type of artificial sweetener for me that affects me. And when I don't have it, I'm good to go. I can have other ones, but just not this one. Sucralose seems to kind of be the one for some people that I hear. I've tested everything else and it seems to be that one. Other people have no issues with them at all, right? So kind of where is the science on that? And I know, again, it's still all emerging, so it's not clearly we know everything, but currently kind of where are things at with that? If somebody's having a normal amount of, let's say, a diet drink or two, or maybe, like a pre-workout or something like that, right? Just a normal amount of artificial sweeteners.
Yeah. And I mean, they could probably even be having an abnormal amount, because when we look at the acceptable daily intake, which is still many magnitudes of times lower than what the actual risk would be given a human equivalent dose, we're looking at over a dozen cans of soda a day across the board for every artificial sweetener. Now when we're talking, so there's kind of also a difference too, I think that's important to point out, that we have our artificial sweeteners, which are sort of the made in a lab artificial sweeteners, and then we have our sugar alcohols, which are naturally occurring. Well, the sugar alcohols are actually going to be far more likely to cause you severe gastric upset. Some of them even have a laxative dose. So that's why you get the little things on the back of the packages that says excessive consumption may have a laxative effect. Because if you're getting more than 20 grams of sorbitol in a day, which you totally can, overseas, whoa, did they like to use their sugar alcohols and their protein bars and stuff like that? And it's you may end up with 13 grams or something in one product. And
you're I'm canceling my talk. I had too much sorbitol.
Yeah, seriously. Oh man. And traveling with Dr. James and Dr. Mike, they eat those bars like there's no tomorrow. So that's gonna cause more issues. The sugar alcohols, because it's sort of a double-edged sword. They're prebiotic. That's great. They're good for the bacteria. They're an energy source for the bacteria. But because they're so rapidly fermented, they, for one thing, they can pull a lot of water into the gut. Then, because they're so rapidly fermented, we get a lot of gas formation. That causes a lot of distension. It can cause cramping. That comes with diarrhea. That's pretty unpleasant. So it's not surprising when people have a response to sugar alcohols. That's actually the P in FODMAP, polyols. Mm-hmm. As far as the made in a lab, scary chemical artificial sweeteners, I'm going to look at it's exactly the processed ones. Saccharin, sucralose, aspartame, acesulfame. We have a pretty good amount of data in vitro, in cell culture. So if you dump a bunch of these artificial sweeteners on cells, they tend to act up and you get inflammatory responses and things like that. We can take it a step further. We can go to animal models. And if you do this in animal models, you get a pretty modest response compared to what we saw in cells. But again, in many cases, and I'm not making it up, authors in reviews have even cited these doses may not be physiologically relevant. In other words, humans cannot eat as much of the human equivalent dose as what we saw in rodents. So it's important to realize that when we feed something to rodents, if we were to give a rodent, a mouse, 1 mg per kilogram of body weight, it does not equate to 1 mg per kilogram of body weight in a human. So we actually have to calculate what the human equivalent dose would be. When we look at the human data, specifically on the gut microbiome, it's very limited. So as far as we can tell, some of these have pretty much no effect at a physiologically relevant dose. If we see that they do have an effect, it's going to be in sort of subpopulations. So only some individuals will have a response to these sweeteners. So, there was one that was out recently that showed that I believe it was saccharin was associated with insulin resistance. Well, that was in 4 people out of 7 individuals who saw any changes in the microbiome out of a much larger cohort for whom no changes were seen. So certainly there's a possibility, and we have to be very careful that we're not like snowflaking ourselves and saying, oh, that's me, that's 100% me, because statistically speaking, we're looking at maybe like 1 out of 10 people or something. That's what I've seen from one study, where, you know, in that case, when we're looking at like 3 or 4 out of, I think, like 36. So a very small percentage of people may have a microbiome that responds in some way. But the other thing to think about is that when we're looking at even just the potential for a compound to affect the microbiota, A, it has to reach the large intestine, and B, it has to interact with them in some way. So I think we have a lot of fear around these things because there are chemicals that we maybe don't quite understand, or they're perceived to, or you know, we're in a documentary or something. But we have to realize that there has to be actually a mechanism for things to happen, and in many cases that just isn't there. And then, you know, the evidence thus far is limited, but it doesn't look like they're posing a huge risk to us, especially if we're looking at drinking like 1 to 2 cans of soda per day. If the alternative is that we're drinking sugar sweetened beverages that cause us to exceed our energy needs, that risk is bigger.
Yeah, they're, as usual, within normal constraints of things. You know, if you're having something at a moderate level, and this is something that a lot of, again, people who are dieting for a show specifically will ask me, like, oh, should I cut out artificial sweeteners? And I'm like, unless you are having some weird reaction to them that I don't know about, that you should probably know about, then I think no. You know what I mean? Like, now, I'm not suggesting that you start pounding more artificial sweeteners the week of your show and change that. But if you're having, you know, a like Powerade Zero and pre-workout, that's fine. You know what I mean? Like, it's very normal, and your body's accustomed to that. So don't really making any big changes like that. So anybody who is listening who maybe is, you know, doing a show or something like that, and they think they have to cut everything out, you know, for peak week, I've never really found validity in that. Again, unless you're having issues. But if you're having issues, then I probably would have cut that out a while ago, a few weeks out, just so we weren't having those problems, right? So it's that's more of the issue, right? Is like, hey, if you're already having issues, we should have been discussing that, taking it out of the plan. Now, kind of the last thing to wrap it up, and then I'll ask you if you have any closing thoughts as well, is just improving regularity in general. I know we've kind of touched on a few things, but just this is something that a lot of people struggle with, whether it's just general like life. I have a lot of postpartum clients who they really struggle, especially after having a child, you know, with regularity, which I know is a totally different thing, but just in general, some like tips to improve regularity, because obviously that's super important. And some people, like, you'd be very surprised until you start digging, like, you don't realize that they like go to the bathroom a few times a week, and it's like a struggle. You know, you're like, whoa, okay, like this is not normal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I would say, you know, number one is always to go to a gastroenterologist if you're really having difficulties. Going to the bathroom, you know, the sort of the normal range could be anywhere from 3 times a week up to 3 times a day. Looking at the quality of stool also matters. So you want it to be well formed, kind of come out in one long piece with maybe some cracks, that it's fairly comfortable. You're not feeling like you're straining. The recommendations usually have to be fairly individualized, because the problem with regularity is the person constipated, or are they experiencing diarrhea? Because we can have like excess, you know, an excess number of bowel movements could also be considered irregular. But I would say, you know, getting to just the low-hanging fruit is always looking at sufficient water intake, sufficient energy intake. So this is one thing that people don't, and it's such a simple fix, but I see it so often with clients who have been chronically dieting, or just have had low energy flux in general, so low energy intake and lower energy expenditure because they've been dieting for so long. The gastrointestinal tract, that motility actually does fall with long-term energy restriction. So if you've been dieting for a really long period of time and you feel like you're constipated, that's because your GI tract is slowing down so it can effectively absorb all of the possible nutrients. So those are 2 of the big ones. So water intake, energy intake.
Water intake's huge. I see that I have people track their water, you know, loosely now, like during the week. And it's so easy now to see when somebody says, oh, hey, like I've had, you know, issues these 2 days this week. And I was like, well, you went from drinking a gallon of water to a half a gallon, and you had 2 hours less of sleep, and you told me that work was stressful. Of course you're not going to the bathroom. You know, exactly. So the water is so important. And I know like it's like a meathead thing to drink a lot of water, but it's not. Like it's so important for just general regularity. And for everybody, it might be different because, you know, some people a gallon is fine, but some people they need more than that. You know, like it's kind of an arbitrary number. I always like to say start around a gallon and just kind of go up or down depending on kind of what fits for you. That seems to be kind of like a baseline, but yeah, the water thing is huge.
Yes, absolutely. And then on top of that would be fiber intake.
Mm-hmm.
Fiber is like, it's a Goldilocks curve. So if you have too little fiber or too much fiber, you could experience constipation or diarrhea, and also the fiber type as well. So depending on whether a person is experiencing more constipation or more diarrhea, they might want to have more soluble or insoluble fiber, but at least trying to look at, are you falling within the recommendations of about 25 to 40 grams per day? And then you can start looking into, you know, for your specific issues, what type you might want to emphasize. So those are the kind of basic ones. Energy intake, you know, and sometimes if you're in a chronic deficit, or if you've been dieting for a while, like for an appropriate amount of time, but still being in a deficit, that's just one of the realities. But water intake, fiber intake, really low fat intake could also affect regularity. And again, that comes with dieting as well. But yeah, absolutely. Stress is another big one. And yeah, if you're at the end of prep, like you're going to be extra stressed.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. At the end of a diet, like you're just not going to be going to the bathroom as much. I mean, that's great, but you're also generally not feeling constipated because there's just nothing. It's just like nothingness there, you know?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. You have no food volume.
Yeah. So it's not even like you were like, oh, I feel like I should be doing this, but I'm not. And it's just, I guess the day will go on. But yeah, so this was really awesome. I really hope that everybody got a lot out of this. So kind of any closing remarks that you want to say as far as like other stuff that you've seen that is just kind of, hey, I want to get this out there. And then also where can people find you and reach out to you, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably my biggest take home, especially with microbiome, is, and I've said this before and have posted about this, but making sure that we are not buying a problem from someone who's trying to sell us a solution. So oftentimes people are using sort of fear-based marketing, and they're making claims about the microbiome and that they really have no business making. They have absolutely no idea. The term dysbiosis, it's like saying inclement weather. Like, hey, we might have bad weather on the way. And you're like, okay, well, what kind? And you're like, I don't know, but you probably just want to buy all of the things that you would need for any type of bad weather, and then you'll be covered. And you're like, I live in Hawaii or something. Like, it's probably not going to snow here. And they're like, snow shovel just in case. So that's what people are doing with the microbiome right now. So I would just, caution people not to fall prey to that. And if they are interested in seeing more of my content, so I'm Vitamin PhD on Instagram and on Facebook. I have vitaminphdnutrition.com, which is really just a list of my podcasts and things that I've written. And they can get in touch with me there or on Instagram if they're interested in doing any sort of consulting or coaching. I am a Renaissance periodization coach. My aim there is a little bit different. I don't focus really so much on GI stuff there. That's where I'm helping people with weight management and performance nutrition. But if they want to talk to me about GI stuff, then I'm happy to do that via Vitamin PhD Nutrition. So absolutely reach out. Check me out on RP Plus and the RP Diet Book 2.0. I've got a section on gut health. And I promise that I am still writing this giant book on the gut microbiome.
I'm so excited. Yeah, whenever that gets finished, but that'll be so worth it. So thank you so much. Seriously, this has been awesome. I know everybody will really appreciate it. So if you guys have any questions, that is where you can reach Gabrielle, and she's a great resource. Like I said, I did consulting with her, and it's a really good option if you just have questions, whether for yourself or you have clients or both. It's just great to kind of say, hey, like I want to talk to somebody who is educated and actually get evidence-based responses. So that's what I do with a lot of people, honestly, in the industry. It's like, I just want to learn from you guys. So can we set up a consult? So that's a really great option. So thank you so much. And if you guys have any questions, please let us know.
Thank you.